For those that I haven't met before, hello, it's very nice to meet you. Look forward to helping in any way that I can. So like Patrick had mentioned, I've spoken to the group before. Conversation previously was around customer discovery, which is really, doing a deep dive into your target market, identifying top problems worth solving, really the earlier stages of what you might do with your respective product business. And today, when Patrick and I got together more recently, it was some of the organizations, some of your companies are getting closer to that scaling stage. In particular, of interest was more information related to product sales, building the process, building the structure, trying to scale as much as possible. So that's a bit of the material that we have prepared for you today. And the book of choice that I mentioned to Patrick that I'd like to feature primarily is called The 4 Steps to the Epiphany, written by Steve Blank. We're going to go into a bit of that content. I've got some slides like I did before to use largely as visuals, just to kind of help facilitate the conversation. But I'd love for it to be interactive. So as you have questions, just ask me at any point. I'm expecting you to kind of stop me, interrupt me. We can start a conversation anywhere, really. So the time really is yours. Use it to the best, of what I can do to kind of provide value for you. I will move through the presentation, which will start with a little bit more background on me, for those that don't know. And then we may bounce around a little bit. My objective would be to try to get through it as quickly as we can while still covering it in detail so that we can reserve time for also an open-ended Q&A if you would like to, or we can refer back to anything that I've prepared so far. So if anyone has any questions now or throughout the presentation, feel free to ask. You can also drop them into the chat as well too. And when I see them, or Patrick or anybody else from the team here, if something pops up and there's a question, please just let me know so that I can address it. But let me go ahead and attempt to share my screen here. So you should see a blue slide. Says product sales with my name on it and all that kind of stuff. Everybody see that okay? Good? Okay, cool. Let me make sure I get the chat window up here as well too, just so I can see that also. All right, perfect. Let me know if anything comes up that I'm missing. Okay, let's go ahead and keep moving. All right, so who am I? This is a little bit of information on me. Background-wise, these are several of the companies that I'm involved with that I have founded or played a founding role in. The top one, Staff Geek, is an HR tech product that is pretty much pure SaaS, marketed at the B2B space. The one in the middle, Podcast Chef, is the newest one that I've worked on. That is to solve problems related to lead generation, business development, and we're marketing that at consultants, which is also what I do in NxtStep, which is provide this product strategy, product management related services. So as I've gone about my routine of learning all the things in building a product business, from both unsuccessfully to the wins and the things that I've done successfully, I've looked to help others with the same thing. So we provide, among others, fractional product strategy advice through NxtStep. So those are the businesses I'm involved with and how they break down into different categories. So that's a little background on me. But moving forward from there, as I mentioned, the book I wanted to feature today to have a conversation about product sales is a book written by an author named Steve Blank called The 4 Steps to the Epiphany. I know there's some folks here that have raised their hand and that they're familiar with this book. For those of you that aren't familiar, I encourage you to get a copy of this really as soon as you can and dive into this book. This book is rumored to have been the one that kind of started the lean startup revolution. So for those that don't know more about Steve's background, Steve taught Eric Ries at the university level. Eric Ries is the one who wrote the Lean Startup. So that one you may be more or less familiar with as well too. A couple of things about Steve's book. I know this conversation is largely about product sales. That's not mentioned on this cover here or any of the detail, but I believe that the 4 steps that he lists in his book that we're going to go into in a little bit more detail really will help you with building the structure, because there's a lot involved. Obviously, everyone here knows that, but help you build the structure and systems that can hopefully help you scale as you reach the later phases and growing your respective product companies. And sales is a big part of that. So to me, the customer discovery element, which is what we talked about last time, and is interestingly enough, the first step of the 4 steps in Steve's book, to me is very similar to sales because you do a lot of the same things. The other steps we're going to talk about here today are really kind of getting to scale from there. Last thing I'll say about Steve's book is it's very tactical in that I love the lean startup from Eric as well too. Steve's book is super comprehensive and it gets granular. So if you're analytical like I can be, you'll really enjoy that aspect of this book. All right, so that's some of the background. So quickly going from there, I'm not going to go into most of the detail in Steve's book because it's dense. There's a lot of incredible information in there, but I'm going to give you kind of the highlights and then let you dive in further. At the end of the presentation, I'll share with you my information. So feel free to reach out, please, if there's anything I can do to help or you have questions about any of this stuff. But to kind of, before we jump into, what you should do, I like to evaluate from the angle, the perspective that a lot of people take that ends up not being the path that you want to go down. And this is a older version, the history of like running startup organizations and building product companies, referred to often as a product development model. The summary that I would give about this model, the steps are listed here in terms of how it typically operates, but it's falling out of favor because of things like the lean startup, which is for the best for our industry and will help others be more successful. But most of the time, those that are using a model like this, where they're rushing a product to market with an inadequate amount of data, they're largely building a product or a solution for a problem that doesn't exist. And I can tell you firsthand that I've been there, and it's definitely not a fun place to be. So that's where a lot of this material came from, and that's how I got started on this journey. But product development model, with rare exception, is not something we necessarily want to be into, unless it makes there's a time and a place for a particular phase for your organization and the industry that you may operate in. But for the most part, we want to do more discovery sooner rather than later because it's going to have heavy influence on what you do and how successful you can be. So what do we do instead? So these are the 4 steps. The text here is going to be quite larger in some future visuals in this presentation, but this is the customer development model. This is what Steve proposes, and he's uncovered these steps and a lot of sub-steps each related to what you want to do along your journey of trying to successfully build and grow and scale your product organization. As I mentioned before, customer discovery is listed there first. Then there's 3 others in here as well too. We're largely going to focus on the middle 2 based on where I think most of the companies here are and where I think most of the kind of magic happens when it comes to product sales. But this is the model you want to leverage, whenever possible, to give you the best chance of success for your product company. Okay, so before kind of get into it, I wanted to pull out one of my favorite quotes from Steve. This one here, I think, really communicates what is a big misconception when it comes to building product organizations. I think a lot of startups fail largely because of this first part of this quote, where there's a lot of focus on the product. Instead, that focus should be on the customer, the problem, and as underlined here, that proven financial model, which is a lot of what we're going to talk about here today. So Steve reinforces this quite a bit in his book. So it's something to take note of. So here are the 4 steps. As I mentioned before, we talked quite a bit about customer discovery last time. Here, I'm going to focus largely on the middle 2. We're going to give an overview of each step as well. So customer discovery, just to summarize, really, as I would define that, is your effort to do discovery with a specific target market, right? Particular personas, and this effort to define what I refer to as a problem worth solving. And when I say problem worth solving, what I mean by that is it's a problem that you have uncovered from those personas for which a certain amount of pain is experienced by that, what could be a future customer of yours. And there is not a solution that currently exists that adequately addresses or solves that problem. That's what I'm referring to as a problem worth solving. I think there's a recording of that previous presentation as well too. So you can get yourself a copy of that. Feel free to dive in as well also, because that will fill in some of the details around the customer discovery phase. So the first of 2 phases that I want to focus on here today, the first is referred to by Steve in his book as customer validation. And to me, what this means, and this is also what's going to be a big objective of yours in trying to grow and scale your company, is you want to build sales into a repeatable process as possible, because that is what's going to help you reach scale. You're also going to, at some point, be looking obviously at delegating that if you haven't done so already, or you don't currently have some help. The more you build it into a process, the easier it's going to be able to delegate with consistent results. And we're going to talk about that in more detail. And then the next phase is the customer creation element. And this is where everything you learned in that validation stage that I was just talking about, where you're building your process, now you're trying to reach greater scale. So you've started the fire, you're fanning the flames, but now it's time to add fuel, right? I want to take what we've learned, I want to roll that into reaching as great a scale as possible, because that's where you're going to be making some of the biggest leaps. And I'll refer to a few other books here as well, too. Another one is referred to, one of my favorites is Crossing the Chasm, which talks about breaking the type of customers down into 4 distinct categories, from early adopters to laggards, and the 2 in the middle are early and late majority. There are certain elements in common with each of these groups of customers. Their psychological, their buying process, they are unique. That's what has them in these various categories. Your effort is, your task or your mission is largely to get beyond those early adopters and into that early majority as quickly and effectively as you can. That's the chasm that's referred to in the book, Crossing the Chasm. So to me, the validation and the creation stages in Steve's process, which is largely what we're going to talk about here, is really in an effort to kind of do something similar that way, really cross that chasm, get between those two categories. And then the fourth step in Steve's process is referred to as company building. This is really kind of additional growth and scale. So this is where you start to build out your team, set up your departments, right? You have established quite a bit at this phase. I talk a lot about this here, since of us are still in like relatively early stage product companies. But at that point, it's really just, helping you make your company more mature from that point forward. Steve goes into a ton of detail on that in his book as well, too. So as mentioned today, the focus is really going to be on these middle 2 steps. That's where I think we're going to get most of our value when it comes to sales and building our process. So I want to focus on those 2 in particular. So we're not going to go into all this. That's the first thing I'm going to say. But this is Steve's complete, like all of the steps that he has listed in just the customer validation phase. I wanted to show you this because it gives you an indication of just how comprehensive and tactical Steve's process gets. So he's got 4 phases of customer validation, and that's part of what I'm going to use to kind of communicate his lessons from each of these and put my own spin on it from what I've seen work well in practice. But I wanted you to get a better idea and just how much detail there is in his book. Each one of these boxes, he goes into significantly greater detail about. They're all intended to be sequential steps. Another thing I'll mention as well is that the 4 steps in Steve's process are intended to be a sequential process, but there's checks along the way to ensure that you have adequately, successfully made it to each of those steps. And the process is designed as such so that if you don't get the kind of data that you need in order to know that you've kind of comprehensively covered that step, that you can take a step back in the process and repeat that phase, that step or that phase. And that is designed into the process and happens quite a bit. I've done it myself a lot. What I love about systems like Steve's is that it gives us a process or a system to follow. It's a guide of sorts, for which there often aren't many for the kind of work that we do when we're growing and trying to grow and scale our product companies. Everything needs to be done always. It's really helpful and convenient to have a guide of sorts or something to follow. So,
hey, Sean, can I ask a quick question on this slide?
Of course, please do.
So this is the second step, and I've not read the book, so I might have lack of information here. The last step is company building, which I'm assuming is when you actually make the steps to build a product. But I see early on here in just the second step, I see hire a sales closer, which would, to me, assume that you're ready for scale. You're ready to sell a lot to customers before you even have a product. Can you speak to that a little bit on, why, or if I have that right? And if I do, why that is the right approach?
I will. Yes. It's a great question. In Steve's system, he goes into basically like when you're ready to start adding members of your team. He starts to get you into the process of thinking through who you might add to your team, especially as it pertains to this important element of sales earlier in the process. When he mentions closer, he's not necessarily referring to someone where you delegate the full like sales process to. This is someone who can take what would you would consider to be like a warm lead or a qualified lead, and then follow the process that you've designed to turn that lead into a customer that's onboarded into your product system and is paying for access to it, according to whatever your business model might be. Also, the other element I want to mention to your earlier kind of point or question, in terms of when you have a product, Steve goes into that as well too. The company building is not necessarily when you will have your product actually in the validation phase. You would have like an early stage MVP of sorts as well also. Throughout the additional phases of this process, however, your product is going to evolve, and it evolves expectedly in a major way between validation and creation, the two steps we're going to focus on today. Validation is more of like the MVP phase. That's where you cobble together your product as best as possible to, in as simple a way as possible, solve the top problem that you've identified through the customer discovery phase with your target market customer. Then you roll those lessons learned from that phase into the creation stage, which is essentially readying your product for greater scale, which is going to be important for those later stage customers you're going to need to pick up in order to reach that scale. And that falls into those 4 categories I mentioned out of crossing the chasm, where you're going from like early adopters or innovators, which are first, especially to that early majority. And they have different criteria when it comes to a buying decision in terms of what they're looking for. Your early adopters or innovators are going to be much more comfortable with newer tech and a product that isn't buttoned up. There's other elements too, and we're going to talk about that later in this presentation. But that early majority is expecting more of a polished and kind of complete product experience. So your product will evolve potentially considerably from that first stage to that second stage in order to cross the chasm, so to speak. That's where the name comes from, and try to onboard as many of those early majority customers as you can. Does that kind of adequately provide more context there, at least for now? More detail will come as we get through this material too.
Definitely. And especially the part where you were allowed to build an MVP during this stage.
Oh, yeah.
Super helpful.
Good. Definitely. Great question too. Keep them coming. Let me know if there's any others along the way as well too. Sometimes I get lost in this stuff, so feel free to just stop me. Thank you. All right. So moving into some of the phases for this period, this customer validation period, quite a bit of what I have here now is essentially how I've interpreted some of Steve's system and what I would recommend you do in order to make sure you've covered your bases when it comes to making sure that you're kind of following his system and doing what you can to be successful. So I've written down here sales materials as an element. To me, I refer to these as various assets that you might need in order to sell on the earlier stage side. So product may be an MVP stage. You're talking to innovators or those folks that just seem to get it. They understand the story that you're trying to tell. They're connecting with your positioning, which is in here as well too. And those materials are going to be critical in order to answering their questions in terms of what they are expecting in terms of a component of telling your story. I think I missed a question. If I go back here, hang on a second. Azim, I think I see a question. What was it? Customer problem, create product, validation, successful trials, and still failed. Got it. Customer centric. Any thoughts? I see. Yeah, Azim, I'd like to dive in further into a little bit more information in terms of saying that it still failed. I think there's a little bit more data I want to get before I necessarily prepare a response for you. But in terms of customer problem, if that's discovery related, and then you moved into generating an MVP and then through the validation phase with successful trials, I don't see anything in there that would, to me, speaks to failure, but I would want to hear more detail in terms of what you mean by that in order to know where things may kind of be stuck. Does that make sense, Azim? And feel free to clarify if you'd like. Oh, not converting into sales. Okay, so perhaps what we have prepared here may help with that. I think we actually talked about that a little bit. And the other element here is there's going to be unique components to your industry, your product, your customer, your business model. So there's a lot more variables to evaluate, but Next place where I would go there, Azim, is I'd want to know why it didn't convert into a sale. Like, what data you have around that. Kind of go at it from that perspective, because like, first question I would have is did they, the validation period, the pilot was the customer paying for your product as part of the pilot? If you can answer that question for me, I'll probably have more direct response for you. Okay, no, yeah. So that to me, I would say, is an element of risk. I would say for anyone building product businesses. I've been there myself too, so I get it. Just having your customer pay anything for access to your product on the earlier side is of and in itself a form of validation. If they're willing to pay you, even if it's $1, the monetary amount at that point in the process largely is almost insignificant. I don't want to say it's insignificant, but it's almost insignificant. The sheer fact that they are willing to pay is a form of validation of and in itself. A lot of customers will be willing to try something new, but not necessarily pay for it. And I would argue that if they're willing to try something new, but aren't willing to pay for it, then they're not really interested in that current value proposition as a solution to a problem they have, or you may not be positioned specifically to their top problem. So that can set you down a path which starts to look like validation, but you may have missed a critical element to that, which is part of what Steve's process dives into further as well too, in that I'm always going to push for everyone to be getting paid for people to use their products, even if on the earlier side, you're giving them some form of discount. That's okay, but I still want them to pay for access to your product, because paying for access to your product is a form of validation. So Azim, I hope that's helpful. Let me know if you have other questions related to that. We can dive into that as well. Okay, let's see. So for the remainder kind of the steps here with regard to validation element, I'm going to go into what some of these assets are that you can prepare and have ready for these presentations that you're going to be having with customers, but it's going to make your life a lot easier. I've been in them without them. And then as I get repeated questions for them, that's usually when I create them. But I know what they are now. So we can, like we've talked through that, hopefully I can kind of skip some steps for you. Got it. Thank you, Izzy. Very helpful. Let's see. Okay. So visionaries, I may refer to, Steve uses this language. When he says visionaries, it's largely those early adopters. It's the folks you're connecting with that your story is resonating with them. And, they're also likely in that early adopter category, and they're willing to take what might be a temperamental or slightly inconsistent product and use it to solve their problem, because they're in a particular phase where they're not desperate for a solution, but their motivation is high. I'll give you some more detail around them as well too, from a profile perspective. Positioning speaks to largely the same, but it's something that's got to resonate with them. We'll talk about that in a little more detail. The verification element is that with whatever you've set out to design in terms of your value proposition for your product, right? Here's the problem my product solves. Here's who experiences that problem. Here's what they're doing to solve that problem today. Here's why that's inadequate. And here's why our solution is better. That story, or your value proposition, the verification phase of the customer validation step in Steve's process is intending to validate that those assumptions were true, right? And if any of them were not, we go back and refine it, can reconduct our pilots, and then until we have the data that says that it was true. So high level overview of some of the stuff we want to ensure that we do as part of this kind of validation phase. So I told you I would tell you more about the sales material stuff. So here's a section dedicated to that, right? So I want to know who your persona is, and I want you to describe them to me like they're a real person with as much detail as possible, like an old friend of yours, if you will. You know who they are, what they do, what they're thinking, what a day in the life looks like. All of these elements, and as tangible as you can get there, the better, because these are folks you're going to need to find using tools like LinkedIn or whatever, right? You need to have conversations with a specific group of individuals that match certain criteria, industry, job, whatever. They are who you are expecting to likely have that problem for which your product is expected to solve. A key element to being able to find them is to really know that persona, right? So it's who you're targeting. The script is knowing how to kind of manage the conversation, right? What are they going to ask about? How do we describe it as effectively as possible to adequately address any of their objections in this process in an effort to get them to using and paying for the early version of our product, right? So that's what your script is for. I have examples of these as well too, if anybody wants to see them. I actually just created them for my podcasting business in particular. a flow chart for this step number 3 here, the process element, which is knowing when to say what you're expecting to say, right? So that may come up in question, or it may be a sequence of how you really want to manage that conversation, right? Having these materials and others I would throw into the mix is having a like demo slide deck, if you will. Another thing I'd recommend is not doing like live demos with your product, more than likely. I have most of the time not seen that go as well as it could. It feels slow, feels like it's too much detail, feels like there's never really enough time to cover what you need to really connect with your target market. Instead, I'd recommend a simple slide deck, which has got some visuals or screenshots of the designs of what your product looks like and what those sections are essentially intended to do. That way, if you're meeting with them like in this fashion, you can walk them through it in terms of how it works and still provide them with the visual of it so they can get a better idea what the experience may be. At a later date, they will use the product, but in the demo format, it's really about you telling the story and answering their questions. So if you're moving around your software application, I think that's less valuable than if they were to, which would be a different situation. So that's another sales asset element to include as well. So this visual here is intended to talk more about sales as a process, right? And this is something that I've built more recently, but this is something I want you to do and think through as well too. As you are going about selling access to your product, I want you to think through what should happen and when you're in conversation with those individuals, and then what your process involves from the perspective of qualifying or disqualifying them as a prospect for your product. I've built a flow chart recently, which I can show you as well, where for our podcasting business, I know essentially, right, I know the problems that I'm going after for the persona that I'm speaking to. And I have laid it out such that we ask about those problems essentially immediately. And we describe them in a way that they get it, or at least understand it. If they understand it, we find out whether or not they have experienced that problem or if they are experiencing that problem. If they know of it and they don't have it because they have a solution for it, they get eliminated as a prospect. They likely have a solution, not a fit, right? Then I go into evaluating if they are aware of the problem that we're intending to solve, and they have a solution for it. They either do or they don't. That's a check as well too. Then the last step in the process to try to qualify a prospect is the solution that they have for that problem working for them, yes or no? If the solution that they have is working for them, that's an opportunity to build a relationship with them from a marketing perspective to grow our awareness with others. We can share their insights and attract more folks that are familiar with this problem, because that's the space we compete in. If the solution they have isn't working for them, that qualifies them as a prospect. So along the way of this the way I flow charted out that process, I am actively trying to essentially disqualify someone as being a prospect. And then when they make it through all of the tests that I have as part of this process, it gets me to the point where I have essentially done everything I can to eliminate their objections in the process of moving forward. Great point as well, Adam. I just catching up here on chat. Thank you for sharing that also, and I totally agree. So building sales as a process, even early on, and even if you're the only one doing it, is going to be valuable for a number of reasons. It'll help you think through it differently. You'll know how to manage it as a process, and then more importantly, evaluate the performance of it as a process, right? What happens at every phase in the conversation? At what point do we come to a juncture? What happens at that juncture? Qualified, disqualified, whatever. As you start to build this and you're selling, then you can look for opportunities to improve it. I just pulled up mine yesterday and I modified it in an effort to evolve it. And I, potentially intending on showing it to you, just a simple flow chart as part of this process. But you will do that over time as well too, because I also want you to track the success for the process. Oh yeah, absolutely. Good question, Jess. Let me pull one up, and hopefully this is a judgment-free zone because I am no artist. So I'll show you my flow chart and you guys will be the judge. So let me see if I have that handy. All right. Oops. Much appreciated. Okay, here we go. I'm just going to drag it into the window here. It should show you guys. Can you guys see? Maybe not yet. Did I pause this. Okay. So can you guys see this flow chart now? Thumbs up or comments or anything like that. I want to make sure you guys can see this. Let me know if you guys can see this or can't see this. Okay, cool. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, we can see it.
Awesome. Thank you. So this is what I was referring to. So at the top here, I have put some key terms to define some of the like wording or terms that I've listed in the flowchart itself. That's an effort for me to try to define and describe this as effectively and succinctly as I can. But more importantly, and I've done this already, I've hired someone to help me with sales and they're managing this process. Now it's for them so that they can understand these things. They can become educated in this and help me scale, right? So that's at the top, but I'll walk you through it as part of the flowchart. So it's pretty simple. There's only a couple of steps to it. And there are this layer here, this first layer is my layer of problems that I am intending to solve for my target market audience. And the target market that we're positioning this as a solution to, for those that are curious, the Podcast Chef business is like a podcasting as a service business, which essentially operates as a more effective lead generation process for consultants, like solo consultants, small teams like mine. That's kind of the range. That's where we live. The problems that we are positioning our product or productized service in this case as a solution for are these two right here. First one is listed here as consulting trap. And the second one is this like acronym RAOM. The consulting trap is this like ebb and flow roller coaster situation that consultants find themselves into. What happens is they invest in like business development. Then they get a wave of new client activity, which gets them busy. As they get busy, they stop investing in what got them busy. And then when their engagements start to naturally end, they wind up at the valley of the roller coaster, which is they're not busy anymore. And panic sets in and they scramble and they wind up scrambling to do what they did before to get their initial wave of clients. And they wind up on this roller coaster. So that's what I'm describing as the consulting trap. I'm working on positioning that as terminology to refer to that problem. The second element here, this RAOM, is referred to as random acts of marketing. Another problem experienced by this persona in question. So they're not consistently investing into marketing like they should, right? If marketing is really to be effective, you need a process for it, you need an infrastructure for it, and you need to continuously be investing in it. Because of this stop-start nature of the work that consultants do, many of them are doing what some in the industry refer to as random acts of marketing. So anyway, that's just some background, but these are the problems, right? And I've tried to effectively describe them to you as succinctly as I can, to the point where you're understanding it and you're on my page. But as part of the process here, I'm checking for both, essentially. Do you have problem A? No. Do you have problem B? No. If you don't have either, you're disqualified, right? For whatever reason, it's not going to make any sense for us to really continue this conversation. If you have either problem, you are moving forward in the process to the solution phase. And that's where I ask about, all right, if you're aware of these problems, do you have a solution to either one or both? If you don't, you are also disqualified. Can anybody here think about or share with me why I might eliminate a prospect from consideration if they don't have an active solution that they're at least trying to one of the problems that my product supposedly solves? And let's take a stab at that one.
Sean, I'll guess here. Is it just it's not enough of a problem for them? It's not enough of a priority?
Nailed it. That's exactly what I'm thinking. And I originally had these flipped, but I adjusted this for exactly what you just mentioned, Jess. Similar to like I mentioned with Zeem in terms of like, you need people to pay for your product when they're using it because that's a form of validation. I want someone to have tried to solve this problem before they consider trying something else. Because in my opinion, if they haven't tried to solve what they are telling me is one of their problems, then to me, it's not a real problem or what I would consider to be a problem worth solving. As such, I'm disqualifying those folks as well too. So moving forward from there, if they do have one, the last test is how effective is it for them? Is it working for them or is it not? If it is working for them, however they're solving it, assuming it's not what we do, then I've written podcast here because to me, that's a marketing opportunity. If someone else knows about this problem, has actively tried to solve it and has a solution to it, not only is that something for me to learn about in terms of like something we may be able to incorporate into our product and strengthen our value proposition, it's a marketing opportunity for us. I want to feature this individual and I want to connect that to our brand and share that value with our audience that we are also targeting, because they're looking for solutions to this problem theoretically, and I want them to come to me to find them or come to our brand to find them. Then if the solution that they currently have is not effective, that's a qualified prospect ready to move forward with the process. We should convert a large percentage of those to paying customers is the expectation. So this is kind of a real world example of a process I'm literally testing at the moment myself, and will evolve on it from here. Any questions about any of this stuff so far?
Sean, can I ask how for that first layer?
And Daddy, look, there's more letters.
Sorry, if they've distilled it, could you have like consulting trap and the RAM concept?
Random acts of marketing.
Should it be that few? Is it a problem if it's like 4 or 5, or how hard do you have to work to distill it to like the 2 main problems that you solve? Because that could be a useful exercise in itself, I guess. But
yeah,
how many?
Great question. I would try to get it as close to 1 as possible, actually, as you could.
Yeah. Okay.
The reason why is because if you come at people and you're saying like, we solve 15 of your problems, how long is it going to take you to have that conversation with them about what all those problems are? And more than likely, so the real reason is that most people are not looking for a solution to anything but their top problem. So if you're solving a different problem in that order, like I know a lot of people that have another common pitfall of product companies is they solve problem like number 4 or problem number 5 for their product. And you might get what that looks like in practice is you're talking to a prospect and they'll say, I love this. We want it, but not yet because we're focusing on 1, 2, and 3 right now, but maybe sometime next year. If you hear something like that, that's a bigger concern. That may be a bigger concern. And what that might mean is you're not solving a problem that is important enough for your prospect. And it's not that they're not telling you the truth when they give you that response. It's that much of the time, they never get around to needing a solution for that problem number 4. Because as they look for solutions to problem number 1, the order and the priority moves around again. So that next year or whenever may never come. In reality, what you're better off doing is repeating this process of Steve's and otherwise to start repositioning your product as a solution to some of those top problems. So more often than not, like if I'm digging myself here, I'm digging myself on having 2. In reality, the change I made yesterday was I had 2 separate workflows here, 1 for problem 1, 1 for problem 2. But the real problem we say we solve is the consulting trap, like probably 3 to 1. So I would do everything you could to like narrow this down to 1. And if you can't articulate the like top problem you solve for your customer rather succinctly, as in it's essentially 1 problem or 2 problems, then I would argue it may be too complicated and you need to simplify it for your prospect.
But if there are multiple personas of your customers, then this layer 2 would be different for each persona for the same product or service. Is that correct?
So that's a great question as well. I would say the difference there, is that's more of a positioning element. So you may be solving the same problem, but there may be different components of that problem that the different personas care about more than the other personas. Let me give you an example. So let's say there's a solution that I have, and whatever it is with that solution, it offers our customers more value and it saves them more money, right? So there's 2 elements of it, right? So if it offers them more value, someone in like the operations department may care most about that value. They're getting time back, for example. So if an operations individual is a persona I care about and is part of that buying decision, someone I need to have an effective conversation with, I'm going to position my product as a solution to adding value and saving time. But if, and this is almost always the case, someone in finance is also involved in that buying decision, let's say the CFO as well, they may care a lot less about saving time or adding value. They may care a lot more about saving money or essentially reducing their cost. If that's the case, I'm going to speak to the same problem, but I'm going to position my product as a solution as cost savings when I'm talking to the finance persona, value add and time saving when I'm talking to the operations persona. Does that example add more context there?
Yes, thank you.
Great question. Any others so far before we keep going? All right, let's do it. Let me switch back to this guy. Right, there we go. Okay, let me know if you guys can't see the slides still. I'll kind of keep burning through the stuff here. So the other reason why I want you to build sales as a process is so that you can evaluate it analytically. I want you to start looking at your numbers, your metrics, and measuring the performance as much as you can. If you're building it into a process, you know what the steps are, just like that flow chart, right? If I put 10 people through that flow chart, I should be able to say who got off at what stop. And as such, I'll know where my percentages are for each of the steps in that process, which will help me refine everything else, my prospecting, my targeting, my positioning, a bunch of different elements that I can also refine if my numbers are not where I want them to be. So largely speaking, that's what it speaks to here. What do your performance metrics look like in terms of how effective your sales process is? That's really kind of the takeaway here. I'll just keep going through this stuff. Next. So I mentioned visionary. Oh, go ahead, Mark.
Sorry, quick question on that. Can you go back to that last slide?
Of course. Let's see. Oops, sorry.
The one about, analytics. Yep. So I've been doing a lot of trying to figure out like cost of customer acquisition, CAC. And there's a bunch of different ways to look at that. And I'm just curious, based on your list of analytics here, would you say that, comparing converted leads and ROI to total outreach is more important, or do you like the idea of cost of customer acquisition? Yeah,
that's a good one too. I would say what I would encourage you to do first is make sure you design it as a process. So, right, like for me, the flow chart works well because I'm a visual in that way. I like to know what the steps are and how they map out in terms of like what steps should be and what process. I think through it from the perspective if I had to train someone to do it the way I know it works or doesn't work. But as you're building it, you may not know how effective it is yet, but build the process first and know what the steps are, and then hold yourself accountable to the process. Measure its performance related to, these are just some metrics listed on the slide. These are not intended to be all of them. Customer acquisition costs, lifetime value, those are all important. And since I've actually got I've got a slide on that in here, I'm just going to jump to it, help us jump around here a little bit. But it probably should be magic ratio. But Mark, I think what you're referring to is more of this kind of stuff, right? So another element I was going to mention when it comes to measuring the performance of all this stuff is this ratio of LTV to CAC, or your lifetime value of your customer to your customer acquisition costs. This is, if you're at this point, you're probably a little bit more mature, I would say. You're beyond some of that early stage stuff. That's why this came later in the presentation. But this is important, and this is an element you want to get to. So if you have this data, that's fantastic. Evaluate this and figure out where your ratios are. For those that are unaware of these concepts, lifetime value of customer is essentially like whatever. Let's assume your product is a subscription level. You're charging $100 a month. Your average customer over the course of however much data you have stays with you for 6 months. So your lifetime value of a customer is $600 in that scenario. If your customer acquisition costs are $200 in terms of how you are measuring it, then you're kind of right where you need to be. And you want to be at this goal of this like 3-to-1 ratio from LTV to CAC. If your ratio is off, however, as in too low or too high, so if this ratio is more like 1-to-1, that can mean that you're underpricing your product, or your customer acquisition cost is essentially too high. Spending too much to get a customer, you're not charging enough for your product. Could be either one of those or both. If the ratio is higher than 3-to-1, you're closer to like 5-to-1. What that means is you're not reaching as many customers as you can. You should be investing more in customer acquisition costs because this is a ratio. This is not, volume. So chances are you could be making a lot more progress if you invest more in reaching more customers. So does that provide some context, Mark? Do you have any follow-up questions to any of that?
Yeah, well, I'll just give you a laugh. On my first pass at calculating LTV to CAC, we're at 14-to-1. So
that's not a bad problem to have.
No, well, either the formula is wrong, or we're not spending enough on acquisition.
Could be an element of both. Who knows, right? Like these are what to strive for, but it doesn't mean that you're going to be there or that you're always going to be there. So don't, right, wherever you are, it's extremely helpful to know where you are, because then you can now make a data-driven decision from there to get you to where you need to be, right? Put things back into alignment in terms of like maximum efficiency. That's the objective there. So now that's fantastic, right? Like anybody who has this kind of data, the sooner you can get it, the better, right? In some instances, it's a little bit harder to get because you need to have a wave of paying customers through your product for as long as they stay with you and all that kind of stuff. So it may take a minute to get this data, but don't lose sight of it. Keep your focus on it as much as you can. And then as you start to get more data, you can use that to make more intelligent business decisions to grow. So good question there for sure. Let me jump around a little bit. So I know, how are we doing on time, Pat? I want to make sure we're still good.
We're good. We're scheduled till 11:30. Cool. A few people had to roll off at 11, but we can definitely keep going.
Okay, cool. Thank you. We're doing making pretty good progress here too, and the questions are fantastic. So please keep those coming. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about this like visionary customer that Steve refers to in terms of like knowing who this individual is. I've given some of these elements here, but I would also refer to this as your like early adopter. In Crossing the Chasm, they talk about it as the innovator. These are the folks that are going to take more immediate interest in your early stage product. So getting a wave of them is fantastic, right? It helps you get some of these metrics that we're talking about. They're not going to be the folks you're going to need to scale, but they will be the people that you need to battle test a lot of your early assumptions related to your product. And these are some of the criteria that basically qualify them as one of these visionaries. In order to really know, you would have some of the elements I just showed you in that flow chart, right? In particular, that solution element, right, that we talked about. And these visionaries, they have more than likely tried some way of solving that problem. And what that means is their motivation is high. So, and Steve adds another element to it, which I think is good as well, that they've also allocated budget to it. As in like they have money reserved to solve this problem, which means they're super serious about solving this problem. No one allocates budget for problems they don't have. So if you're hearing things like that, that's great. That could be one of your visionary customers, and they're important on the early side of things. They're going to help you magnify your message, reach more people. They have a great experience. They're going to be your biggest cheerleaders. That stuff is super helpful as you approach that chasm in your effort eventually to like refine your product from what you've learned through that user research, and then prepare to make that leap into that early majority as successfully as you possibly can. All right, so I put in here a Q&A section for customer validation phase. So if anyone has any general questions about what we talked about so far, feel free to just ask. But I think you guys have done a pretty good job in just like jumping in when you have questions. So I don't know that we need to pause, but I'll give it a second in case anybody has any other ones they want to ask at this point. I'll put up the next slide just in case. Okay, so keeping things moving here. The customer creation, so that's the validation stuff, right? There's a lot more detail in Steve's book, right? We only have so much time. So I'm kind of hitting the high level points for you, but again, strongly encourage you to get a copy of it and dive in and be prepared to take notes because it's dense in a good way. The customer creation phase of Steve's process is the third step. And in it, this is a similar map to the elements that he has there too. Moving on, quickly to my take on some of the high level elements, right? The phases that he speaks to. After you've done the validation phase, you have, waves of early adopter, innovative customers through your product experience. They've paid for access to your product. You've largely had the opportunity to validate your value proposition for your product. You've learned a lot, right? And you're ready to make more progress from here at a greater scale. Customer creation is your first phase in that. Customer creation and company building are big in that phase in terms of where you're going. You're going after that early majority now. So it gets more granular. And specifically, we'll talk about market type, which is essentially how you're competing in your market. And there's a couple of categories there I'll talk about in a moment. But then at this point, you will essentially start to be ready to start hiring some help with some of these things, in particular around positioning. The right marketing agencies, PR firms, these folks are, the right one, that's a good match for you and your company, matches your vision, gets your industry, all that kind of stuff. We'll help you refine your messaging. We'll help you collect all of this data that you have, organize it, and figure out like a lot of these things I've been saying in terms of describing it as succinctly as possible so that when your message reaches the right person, right, those personas, they're just going to be like, take my money, in terms of like, I finally found what I've always been looking for kind of thing. That's what these firms are going to help you do. And Steve's big on encouraging that when you're ready for it. The product launch phase of this step talks quite a bit about taking those lessons learned from the validation phase and then building those into your product to make it more mature and a more complete product experience. Again, largely in an effort to satisfy the concerns of this early majority in the process, because that's what's really going to help you reach scale. Marketing, advertising, relatively self-explanatory, but that's as much about driving demand into what's now should be your sales channel. So you've built your process, but then you also develop a channel over time as well too. It's kind of, think of it like a funnel. You probably heard of that analogy in this process as well too before. Same thing. So we'll talk more about all of these. Right? It's all about driving demand. I want to talk just for a moment briefly, because this can get, there's a lot to talk about here, but there's different market types, if you will, in terms of like how your product essentially is competing against other options in the industry and how your prospects or customers are thinking about your product. I think Steve goes into 4, but I listed as 3. It's existing market. Essentially, you're competing against a number of existing options that are in the market. So it's largely a land share grab. You're trying as much as you can to compete against the options that are already there. Number 2 is a new market. Think like the Airbnbs of the world, which, their story is one that is not without a significant amount of adversity, because one of the most famous quotes I think attributed to their success is, it took us 5 years to become an overnight success. That should tell you that competing in a new market is largely about education, which is both time consuming and expensive. However, that being what it is, just like Airbnb has done, if you are able to do that successfully, it can be very lucrative and then can eventually be a rocket ship, just like that quote implies. The third element, which is one I'm particularly fond of myself, is a resegmented market. That's where you look to compete in a unique way. An example I might give for a resegmented market might be, for those of you that are familiar, and actually it's what I used to put this together, Canva. Canva is like an Adobe. So Adobe makes a million different types of graphics and visual software tools, right? For those experts out there. I've used those tools for years. I'm maybe an average engineer, probably that's even being a little bit giving me more credit than I deserve. I can't figure any of that stuff out. However, in Canva, I'm a wizard and I can do it in like 2 seconds. So I'm a total fanboy of their software. But they resegmented a market, right? Adobe has a lion's share of it, but a lot of folks have had a similar experience like me. And when Canva came along, they're like, I've been waiting for this. I didn't even know that I needed this, but this solves a big pain point for me. So that's resegmented market elements. So we could talk more about that stuff, but the different ways that you're competing in your market are going to have implications for what you do in this phase. In Steve's book, he goes through that in significantly more detail. So that's an area to spend a little bit more time and to think more critically about which category does your product fall into, because it's going to have implications for how you prioritize what you do in this phase and the approach you use to going about capturing market share and scaling from there. The positioning element we talked a little bit about already, but this is where you're going to introduce new elements to it. So not just the product, but also the company. You want to, and this is where hiring that kind of help is going to matter. The PR firms, the marketing agencies of the world are going to help your message reach a wider audience. You want folks to think about you synonymously as a solution to that problem in particular, whatever top problem it is you solve for your target market and those personas. But making your message sticky and memorable and all that kind of stuff will really help. I went through that exercise with a branding and PR agency with Staff Geek. And before I did, this was so many years ago, I basically didn't know even what it was for the most part. As I was doing it, I still kind of didn't get it. Seeing the effect that it's had after I've been through it, even though I would say, especially then, it was expensive, it was so worth it. It made a dramatic difference to getting our story out there, positioning and branding everything the right way. Anyway, long story short, it's likely a process where you're going to get a lot of value, but not until you're ready. The influencers reference here is when you start to get the attention of, and then hopefully the approval of folks that command a following in your industry. And I'll explain more about that. So Steve goes into different categories of like what an influencer is called. And we're not talking Instagram influencer here. We're talking industry experts. Steve also lists them as evangelists and connectors. Those are three different categories that Steve gives, but the experts of the world, like to give you an idea, he refers to Gartner. So Gartner officially recognizes your industry if it's new or your company because of what it's done, right? That's a huge deal. You get published in the Wall Street Journal, like all of these type of things make a major difference, major impact. So Staff Geek, as I mentioned, is a HR tech product, right? I'm sure some of us are at least familiar with Adam Grant and his work in people analytics and all things people related in HR, right? He has a significant influence. One of our goals at Staff Geek would be to get Adam Grant to bless our Staff Geek product. It's like he sees that, he looks at that, and he's like, "This is so cool. Everybody needs this," right? That's a game changer. If someone like that says something like that about our product. So that's part of the effort here as well too. So this is all related to, it's all positioning related stuff. Then as part of the product launch element of what you'll be doing, again, this gets into quite a bit more detail depending upon that market strategy that you're competing in, whether or not your primary target, if you're in an existing market, it's a land grab. You're trying to capture as much market share as quickly as you can, and that gets pretty competitive. If you're in a new market or you're trying to build a new market, that is much more targeted and strategic, but it's all about educating, which has its own unique challenges. And if you're in the resegmented market, you have to do elements of both. So related to what you want to do with your product, what I just mentioned, based on what strategy might be right for you, is going to be your launch strategy. As in, this is our primary objective for what we want to do with our product based on that launch strategy for ourselves. The other elements in here all refer to that as well too. The validation element, in this case, with regard to your product, isn't essentially about does my product work, because we should have that data at this point. This one is how far and wide has your message been received. So if after all of this effort, you've been published in one or two lesser known publications that people haven't heard of, a little bit less successful than we were hoping for, right? But you've got Gartner, Wall Street Journal, whatever, something significant that has a relatively wide audience. That's the type of noise you're trying to make as part of this process. There's Spider-Man. True to fashion. The marketing and advertising stuff is probably a bit more straightforward, so we may not even need to go into as much detail here. In fact, I want to get to some of the rest of the material here, so we can always come back to this, but you want to be strategic about this as well also. So after you've had the kind of success that you're hoping for, this is an effort to reach a greater scale with the right help that you need at the time in which you need it. And again, heavy emphasis on tracking performance, measuring those metrics, and then iterating as much as possible to try to make improvements wherever you can. So since we're talking still about product sales, and I promise you all this stuff is related, as you start to kind of build and grow your team and further refine your process, I want you to think more about delegating it. Sales is always going to be important, but more important than anything is after you start to figure out the process and you know what's repeatable, now we need to validate how scalable it is. So repeatable first, scalable next, right? And I encourage founding members of the team to be building as much of the process, as much of those assets as possible yourselves in the earlier phases as you're building the original process. At a minimum, the folks that are involved in the customer discovery phase. So doing research with customers, identifying the top problems we're solving, refining your value proposition. The folks that have been involved in that, hearing from customers, should also be involved in building the first version of your process, sales process, that is, in an effort to make it repeatable. And you can do that if you're measuring its level of success. Right? Think back to the flow chart, simple spreadsheets, whatever, right? You know the steps, you put a certain number of conversations through it. What do your numbers look like after it's all said and done? How many people do you need to talk to turn into customers that pay and all that good stuff? After you've got that, you should know whether or not it's repeatable after you start to have some form of repeat success, right? What does our conversion rate look like? Okay, great, it's repeatable. Now it's not an effort of well, that element would help as well too, but the next step is more, we need to reach greater scale, right? So it's a volume component. So in order to do that, you may start hiring help, whether part-time or full-time or otherwise. That's where you're going to start preparing your process to be delegated, bringing on new members of your team. So if you've built the process yourself, you should be able to teach it as well also, which is another form of really true mastery. But as part of this phase, I would encourage you to look to the most cost-effective elements in terms of starting to delegate it. That's bringing in help that is ready to take from your process and then continue its success. And then for you to kind of collaborate back and forth with one another if you aren't directly involved as part of this phase in terms of how you can make it better. But the bottom element here, I want to make sure folks are well aware of as well too, and that you're going to have to expect a certain amount of loss in that. You've built all of this stuff. So chances are no one's going to be able to do it as well as you can. Someone may at some point, but as part of the first phase of this process, whoever you're delegating it to, they may not be there yet. So I would expect a percentage loss, some percentage loss. I would say a good rule of thumb, if it's working and you're successfully to and through this phase, is an 80% success rate upon what you were capable of. So if previously, out of 5 conversations or out of 4 conversations, 1 converted, now it might be out of 5 conversations, 1 converts. Or, if you originally had a 5-to-1 return on investment, now you might be looking at a 4-to-1 return on investment when you bring someone else into the picture. That's a good kind of rule of thumb to know that your process is working well enough in repeatable fashion to the extent where now it's also scalable. So you can take that process and you can repeat it. You can hire more sales help when you need it. Any questions related to this subject matter here?
I don't have a question, but I'll just share an experience that hindsight I should have thought of, but I didn't. When earlier this year, we started kind of scaling out our sales process, and I had somebody else doing it with me, and we started selling more. And I realized very quickly that our order fulfillment operation sucked and wasn't set up to handle the volume that was increased. In hindsight, I should have realized pretty quickly to look at that, but that was a lesson learned from me to, if I'm scaling up my sales, make sure I'm ready for the volume.
Good problems to have, but still problems, right, Mark? Thank you for sharing that. Another element I'll reinforce here too is another book that I've read recently, which is one of the ones I'm going to recommend at the end of this presentation. They talk about, and this speaks to the random acts of marketing problem. Obviously, we're talking about sales, but the point is to make sure you have the infrastructure that you need in order to support it. If you're missing pieces of the puzzle here, it's going to make it really difficult to be performed consistently. So that can take some time to build, but is critically important in order for you to be able to measure its effectiveness, to refine it, and to improve it from there. So take it from where it is, make it better, right? That's the objective.
Sean, can I ask, it sounds like you're saying you want a lot of that sales process sort of refined and smooth and understanding how to be effective before you delegate and scale it. Does the same go for advertising and marketing? I feel like we talked to some companies that they've done a few sales, but they are wondering okay, now how much should I invest in advertising and marketing versus continuing my own outreach or other, and they want to, I think in reality, they're dabbling in both kind of continuously and growing them, but is there how you're ready for larger scale marketing?
Yeah, that's an excellent perspective to think through this. Couple things. If you don't have that area of expertise or you don't know that world well, I'm always encouraging you to get the kind of help you need to be intelligent about how you're allocating your funds, right? Be conservative with your investments, especially in the early stage, but when the time's right for that kind of stuff, hire the help you need in order to complete it or conduct it successfully. Additionally, what I would say is, before you do that, I want you to have a lot of this process that I'm calling sales infrastructure. I want you to have the process nailed down, the steps, the top problems that you solve, your sales script. I want you to know what the numbers look like when you're managing this process yourself. However, you're getting connected to your leads and managing those conversations. I want you to know what your conversion rates are, all of that kind of stuff. Why do I want you to know what that is before you hire that help? So that you can know whether or not it's working. That's the element, because a lot of these things can be just budget that ultimately gets spent. And the reason I don't want you to be in a position where I've been before, unfortunately, hopefully I won't make those mistakes again, right? That's part of learning, but is that I've allocated budget for something and I've conducted an experiment. I can't really say definitively one way or the other whether or not it worked because I don't have the results. If I've built that process earlier on, you're going to know to a T what to expect from the channel that you're currently managing, however you're getting connected to those leads and however many of them are converting based on the process and steps that you're managing today. Then as you reach out to some of these folks for help, marketing and advertising, for example, you can see how did that boost my volume? What did my conversion rates go to and go from and now to? Did it improve? Did it get worse? Right? You can be tangible with your measurement of, did this help? Did it hurt? Or is it somewhere in between? Right? And then you can ultimately be able to get to that ROI conversation, right? Because if you're not getting $3 to $5 back for every dollar that you're spending, then something needs to change, basically. Good question.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I've only got a couple of slides left here. We talked about this ratio. This is an important one. Again, this is going to take time to get to. But after you've passed enough customers through your product experience, it's been a positive one. You know how long they've been around. Start to also evaluate your costs, right? And if you have hard costs, great, right? Maybe you ran some, small marketing campaigns or advertising campaigns or whatever. You can throw those into the mix. But also include your time. So if you've done the prospecting, if you know who you've reached out to and how long that's taken, set a accurate, dollar amount on your time in terms of what that might cost to ultimately delegate when you're ready. And that's another element I'll mention as well, too, in terms of response to your question, Pat, is if you build that process first and then you bring on the sales help, you're going to be able to do so much more cost effectively because at this point, you're basically bringing someone in to follow the process you already built and works, as opposed to hiring someone to come in and educate you on these things or build a process from scratch or whatever, which in my opinion works much more inconsistently than if you build a process yourself, really. That's an element of the work that you're doing. I would put that responsibility on the founder essentially, or whoever's responsible for sales at that point. But when you can get to this kind of data, like Mark had shared, that's going to be particularly insightful to have a better understanding. And how do I adjust the dials, flip some switches in order to get things where they need to be to support optimum growth. So the stuff that I've got here is customer creation related. I've got a couple of book recommendations and then just information on my end. It looks like I've got some broken links here. Sorry about that. But this is really a plug for 3 books in particular. Steve's is one of them. The other one is Crossing the Chasm. And the third one is the 1-page marketing plan. I'll get you links to each of those books so that Pat and company here can kind of send them around to the group so that you guys have those recommendations as well. Also, then the only other elements I have in here, this is the stuff we do at NxtStep. If you need any help with any of this kind of stuff, it's customer research, discovery related, MVP type things, everything we talked about here today. And this is my contact information. I essentially operate as a fractional product officer now, having been down this road myself so many times, doing it with my own products. Love an opportunity to help anybody who's looking to do the same. This is, I can't thank Pat and the team enough for the opportunity to speak to you guys, not just once, but twice. I love doing this stuff. I love sharing this information with people that are doing really cool, innovative things like all of you are. I encourage you to keep going, be as successful as you can, and reach out for help whenever you can, whenever you need it. So this is my contact info. Reach out whenever you'd like. No cost associated with any of that kind of stuff. Plenty of advice available, whenever I can help. If at some point, you need more substantial or recurring help or whatever, then there's always an opportunity to have a conversation about that. But as a thank you to Pat, as a thank you to everybody, the team here, I'm happy to, help anybody totally free of cost with whatever I can, with wherever you may be stuck or planning next steps from there. Thank you, Sean. Awesome stuff. And always packing in a lot in our in our 90 minutes, but not too much. It's you can tell by the questions and everything that people are
are right with you. So I am particularly impressed with the diagram that you showed. We might have to talk more about that and see if we can get people using that. Anything else for Sean or from the group before we call it a morning? Cool. And then go ahead.
I was going to say thank you, Sean. That was very insightful.
Good. You're very welcome. Thank you for being here and having me.
And we'll let us know, folks. Charlie, 1 second. We're almost done. If you have other topics you want us to hit, we don't have anything scheduled yet for December or into the new year. So taking ideas. Maybe one of these days we can get together over coffee as a group or later in the year in person. So appreciate everyone being enthusiastic and loyal to this group, and great exchanges happening every month. So we really appreciate everyone's involvement.
I'm dropping some links in here as well to Pat for those.
Great. Yeah, we'll send
books that I was referencing at the end there
with some resources for everybody.
Perfect.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good weekend.
Thank you so much. Bye, Sean. Thank you.
See you guys.